My name is William Cooper, and I'm taking my kids back to the place where I lost their mother. Some might call me crazy for returning to Yellowstone, especially now when the tourist season is ending and the park feels empty and strange. But I need answers. We all do. I'm 52 years old, and for 15 years I worked as a ranger here at Yellowstone National Park. I knew every trail, every geyser, and thought I understood all the park's mysteries. But 3 years ago, my wife Sarah disappeared near Old Faithful, and nothing made sense after that. Now I'm driving our old 1975 Winnebago Brave down familiar roads, sneaking glances at my kids through the rearview mirror. Jake, my 16-year-old son, hasn't smiled much since we started this trip. He sits with his headphones on, staring out the window at the golden autumn trees. Emma, my 14-year-old daughter, keeps flipping through her mom's old photo albums. She was always the most like Sarah, curious, brave, and maybe too smart for her own good. The park feels different in late October. The usual crowds are gone, leaving behind an odd silence that's broken only by the hissing of distant geysers and the rumble of our RV's engine. Dark clouds hang low over the mountains, and the air smells like snow and sulfur. As we get closer to Old Faithful, I can feel my hands getting sweaty on the steering wheel. I haven't told the kids everything yet. I haven't told them about the strange things I saw when their mother vanished, or about the dreams that keep bringing me back here. All they know is that we're spending their fall break camping in Yellowstone, trying to find some closure. But deep down, I know we're here for more than that. Something is calling us back, and as the sun starts to set behind the steam clouds rising from the valley, I can't shake the feeling that this trip is going to change everything. We pulled into the Old Faithful camping area just as the sun was setting. The place was nearly empty, just a few other RVs scattered around, their lights glowing softly in the growing darkness. I chose a spot far from the others, close to where Sarah and I used to watch the geyser erupt under the stars. "Dad, it's freezing out here," Emma said, hugging herself as she stepped out of the Winnebago. She was right. The temperature had dropped faster than usual, and our breath came out in white puffs. Jake helped me set up the campsite, though I could tell he was angry. He barely looked at me as we pulled out the folding chairs. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. That's when I noticed an old Native American man watching us from the edge of the parking lot. He walked with a wooden cane, and his face was lined with so many wrinkles it looked like a map. Something about the way he stared at our campsite made my skin crawl. "The spirits are restless," he said as he approached us. "The earth beneath us is changing. Even Old Faithful isn't keeping her schedule like she used to." Emma moved closer to me. "What do you mean?" The old man, who introduced himself as Joseph Running Bear, a Shoshone elder, pointed his cane toward the geyser field. "The underground heat is growing stronger. Things that have slept for centuries are starting to wake up. You should not camp here, especially not with children." I wanted to dismiss his warning as just an old story, but 15 years as a ranger had taught me to listen when locals spoke about the land. Plus he was right about Old Faithful. According to my old ranger friends, the famous geyser had been erupting at odd times lately. As Joseph walked away, the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains. The only light came from our lantern, and the strange ghostly glow of steam rising from the ground. The usual nighttime sounds of the park, the crickets, the distant howl of wolves, seemed muffled, as if something was holding its breath. "Let's get inside," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's getting cold and I'll make us some hot chocolate." That night, as Jake and Emma slept in their bunks, I sat by the RV's window, watching the steam drift across the empty parking lot. The clock showed 2:17 a.m. when I first heard it. A low rumbling sound, different from a geyser's normal burst. And in the distance, where the steam was thickest, I could have sworn I saw something move. But that was just the beginning of our long dark night in Yellowstone. I woke up to Emma shaking my shoulder. The early morning light was gray and dim through the RV's windows. "Dad, you need to see this," she whispered. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing out the window. I followed her outside, zipping up my jacket against the unusually bitter cold. That's when I saw them, long, deep scratches running down the side of our Winnebago. They looked like claw marks, but bigger than any bear could make. And something even stranger, steam was rising from the grooves, like they were hot to the touch. What could have done this? Emma asked, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The thundering of hooves. A huge herd of bison was charging across the valley, running faster than I'd ever seen them move, but they weren't running toward something. They were running away. Jake came stumbling out of the RV, his hair messy from sleep. What's going on? Why is it so cold? He was right. The temperature had dropped so low that frost covered the grass, even though it was mid-morning. Steam vents that were usually predictable were now shooting out random bursts of mist. Old Faithful itself seemed quieter than normal, like it was holding back. That's when I remembered something from my ranger days. I hurried back into the RV and dug through my old box of park documents. There it was, a worn logbook from 1936. My hands shook as I read the faded writing. October 21st, 1936. Unusual thermal activity reported. Extreme temperature drops. Wildlife behaving erratically. 3 visitors missing near Old Faithful Basin. Search parties found nothing but steam. The logbook felt heavy in my hands. Outside, the mist was getting thicker, and somewhere in the distance, we heard a sound that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. Emma pressed close to me. Dad, what's happening? I looked at my children's scared faces, and knew I had to tell them the truth. I think we might know what happened to your mom. Just then, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and Old Faithful started making a sound I'd never heard in all my years as a ranger. The mist was closing in around our RV, and in it, something was moving. The mist swirled around us, thick and hot, smelling like rotten eggs. Through the steam, I saw something that shouldn't exist, a tall dark shape moving on 2 legs. It was at least twice as tall as me, with skin that looked like cracked, burning rock. Steam poured from its mouth, and the gaps in its skin, and its eyes glowed like hot coals. Get in the RV, I shouted, pushing Jake and Emma toward the door. But before we could reach it, a burst of scalding steam shot up from the ground right in front of us, blocking our path. That's when we saw it clearly for the first time, the Wendigo. Not the skinny frozen creature from normal legends, but something born from Yellowstone's burning heart. Its fingers ended in long claws that steamed in the cold air, just like the marks on our RV. The thermal networks, I whispered, suddenly understanding. It's using the underground hot springs to move around the park. Emma grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. Dad, look. She pointed to a patch of ground where the grass was turning black and shriveling. The creature wasn't just giving off heat, it was stealing it from everything around it, making the air freeze. The missing people, Jake said, his voice shaking. Mom, was it? I pulled them both close as the Wendigo moved closer, steam curling around its burning form. In its eyes, I saw the truth. All those disappearances over the years, including Sarah's, had been its doing. It had been feeding on heat, and I couldn't finish the thought. We backed away slowly, as more geysers began erupting around us, but not naturally. The creature was controlling them, using the park's heat to trap us. The steam was getting thicker, making it hard to see, and harder to breathe. Then Jake spotted something near the creature's feet, a small half-buried object, partially melted by the heat. Even from a distance, I recognized it. Sarah's camera. The Wendigo reached for us with its burning claws, and I knew we had only seconds to act. But what could we do against something that controlled the very ground beneath our feet? The answer came with Old Faithful's rumble behind us. The geyser was building up to another eruption, right on schedule. And suddenly, I realized why the creature was here, and maybe, just maybe, how we could stop it. Many geysers suddenly burst up all around us, making a circle of boiling water and steam. We were trapped. Jake tried to run for the RV, but a blast of scalding water caught his arm. His scream made my heart stop. Jake, Emma and I pulled him back. His sleeve soaked and burned, his face was twisted in pain, and ugly red blisters were already forming on his arm. While I wrapped Jake's burn with my jacket, Emma made a dash for the fallen camera. I wanted to stop her, but she was too quick. She grabbed it and ran back, the Wendigo's claws missing her by inches. "The photos, Dad." Emma's hands shook as she opened the camera's back. The last few pictures were damaged by heat, but still visible. They showed Sarah taking photos of Old Faithful, then something dark rising from the geyser's pool. The final shot was just a blur of steam and glowing eyes. That's when it hit me. Old Faithful erupted every 90 minutes, like clockwork. The Wendigo was always strongest during these eruptions, using the geyser's power. It had been feeding off this predictable source of heat for who knows how long. "It's getting ready," I said, watching Old Faithful starting to steam more heavily. "The next eruption is in 10 minutes. Jake, still holding his burned arm, looked up at me. "What do you mean?" "The creature needs Old Faithful's schedule. Its power comes from knowing exactly when the heat will come." I looked at our RV, then at the geyser's opening. A crazy idea formed in my mind. If we could disrupt that pattern. Emma's eyes widened. "Dad, no. Get your brother to the ranger station," I said, pressing the emergency flare gun into Emma's hands. "Follow the main road. Don't stop." The Wendigo was closing in. Old Faithful's steam was getting stronger. We had maybe 5 minutes before the next eruption. "Dad, please." Jake tried to grab my arm with his good hand, but I pulled away. "I love you both," I said, then ran for the RV before they could stop me. I jumped into the Winnebago and turned the key. The engine roared to life as the Wendigo spun toward the sound. Through the windshield, I could see Jake and Emma running toward the road, Emma supporting her brother's injured side. Good kids. Smart kids. They'd make it. The creature was between me and Old Faithful's opening. Perfect. I pressed down on the gas pedal, hard. The RV lurched forward, gathering speed. The Wendigo raised its burning arms, and steam exploded from the ground in front of me. But I didn't stop. "This is for Sarah," I whispered, and aimed straight for the monster. At the last second, the Wendigo jumped aside. Exactly what I'd hoped for. The Winnebago's tires hit the slippery rocks around Old Faithful's opening. I felt the vehicle starting to tilt. Through the side mirror, I saw Emma and Jake standing at the road's edge, their faces lit by the emergency flare they'd set off. The front of the RV slid into the geyser's opening just as the pressure was building for an eruption. Hot water started filling the cabin. The Wendigo screamed, a sound like steam escaping a broken pipe. It knew what was about to happen. "Go," I yelled, even though my kids couldn't hear me. "Run." The last thing I saw was the Wendigo's burning face at my window, its coal red eyes wide with fear. Then everything exploded. The ground shook as Old Faithful's whole system was thrown into chaos. The RV blocked the main vent, forcing the pressure to find new ways out. Steam burst from dozens of new cracks in the ground. The Wendigo's screams got weaker as its power source was disrupted. I felt the heat coming, knew I only had seconds. I thought of Sarah, of the kids, of all the years I'd spent in this park. Then the world turned white with steam and pressure. Later, park rangers would find Jake and Emma walking along the road, burned and tired but alive. They would discover Old Faithful changed forever, its predictable schedule destroyed, and a new geyser, formed where the RV went down, would start erupting every 52 minutes. My age. Some say on quiet nights, when the steam rises and the stars are bright, you can still hear the Wendigo's dying screams, but it never showed itself again. The thing that took Sarah was gone, and my kids were safe. That's all that mattered. My name is Timothy Reynolds, and I'm 12 years old. What happened to my family at Mount Rushmore still gives me nightmares. Sometimes when I look at rocks or stone walls, I swear they moved just a little bit. Mom says it's just my imagination, but after what we saw that summer, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when Dad got this big job for his museum. He's a curator, which means he takes care of all the old stuff and puts together exhibitions. This time he needed to study some ancient Lakota artifacts from the Black Hills in South Dakota. That's how we ended up driving our silver Airstream land yacht RV across the country in June 1965. I was actually pretty excited about the trip. Our RV was like a shiny bullet on wheels, and I loved camping. Plus, my 9-year-old sister Margaret wouldn't stop talking about seeing the big heads on Mount Rushmore. Mom packed enough sandwiches and snacks to feed an army, and Dad brought all his research stuff, notebooks, cameras, and what felt like a million books about Native American history. The drive through the Black Hills was amazing. Tall pine trees stretched up towards the sky like green fingers, and sometimes we'd spot deer watching us from between the trees. But the real showstopper was when we first saw Mount Rushmore. 4 giant faces carved right into the mountain, looking out over everything like giants frozen in stone. I remember thinking they looked almost alive, like they might blink at any second. We found a perfect camping spot in the Black Hills National Forest. Dad picked it because we could see Mount Rushmore from our site, and it was close to where he needed to do his research. As we set up camp, Margaret kept saying the presidents were watching us. I told her she was being silly, but honestly, something about those huge stone faces made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That first night, while Mom made hot dogs over the campfire and Dad sorted through his papers, I noticed something weird. Our RV had moved. I was sure Dad had parked it facing away from the monument, but now it was turned so the front window looked right at those stone faces. When I mentioned it, Dad just said he must have remembered wrong about how he parked it. I should have known right then that something wasn't normal, but none of us could have guessed what those stone faces were hiding, or what would happen to our family over the next few days. Looking back now, I realize those first strange little things were just the beginning. The real horror was still waiting for us, hidden in the ancient rock of Mount Rushmore. The weird stuff really started the next morning. Dad was going through some old files he'd borrowed from the park office. Yellowed papers from when they built Mount Rushmore back in the 1930s. I was trying to read my comic book, but I kept getting distracted by how Dad's face got more and more worried as he read. "Helen, come look at this," he called to Mom, his voice all quiet and serious. I pretended to keep reading my comic, but I was really listening to every word. Dad showed Mom some papers about strange things that happened during the monument's construction. Workers reported seeing faces in the mountain, even before they started carving. Some quit their jobs because they said they felt like something was watching them from inside the rock. That same afternoon, Margaret started acting strange. She sat at the picnic table for hours, drawing picture after picture. Usually, she draws horses or flowers, but these were different. They showed dark figures that looked like they were made of stone, with rough, rocky skin and deep cracks for eyes. When Mom asked her about them, Margaret just said, "They're the stone people. They come out at night to check on their mountain." I tried to laugh it off, but my stomach felt kind of sick, because that morning, I'd seen something too. I woke up really early to use the bathroom, and when I looked out the RV window toward Mount Rushmore, I could have sworn I saw something moving on the face of the mountain. Not the carved presidents, this was different. Like shadows shifting across the rock, but more solid somehow. That evening, Dad tried to park the RV differently so the headlights wouldn't shine on the monument all night. But when we woke up the next morning, it had moved again. The front was pointing right at Mount Rushmore, just like before. Dad checked the parking brake twice, but couldn't figure out how it had turned around by itself. "Maybe it rolled a bit in the night," Mom suggested, but her voice sounded shaky. She knew as well as we did that our campsite was completely flat. Later that day, I found Dad reading an old leather book about Lakota legends. He had this really serious look on his face, like when he's trying to solve a really hard puzzle. When I asked him what he was reading about, he closed the book quickly and tried to smile. "Just some interesting local history, Tim," he said. but I saw what was on the page before he closed it. It talked about ancient spirits that lived in the sacred mountains, and how they didn't like it when people changed their home. That night, as we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, no one talked much. We all kept glancing up at Mount Rushmore, watching as the sunset shadows crept across those giant stone faces. And maybe it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn those shadows didn't move quite the way they should have. I woke up in the middle of the night to a weird scratching sound outside the RV. At first I thought it was just a raccoon or something, but then I heard Margaret whimpering in her bunk. "Tim," she whispered, "they're here." I climbed down and peeked through the window with her. What I saw made my whole body go cold. There were shapes moving in the darkness, not like animals or people, but like pieces of the mountain itself walking around. They started as small as pebbles, then grew bigger, stretching up like clay being pulled until they were as tall as Dad. Their bodies looked rough and jagged, like they were made from broken rocks stuck together. One of them turned toward our window, and I saw its face, if you could call it a face. It had deep cracks where eyes should be, glowing with a faint blue light like the moon reflecting off stone. "We need to wake up Mom and Dad," I whispered to Margaret, but my voice came out all shaky. Just then, one of the creatures touched our RV, and the whole thing shuddered. Where its hand met the metal, a gray color spread out like frost on a window, and the metal started to look rough, almost like it was turning to stone. Mom's scared voice came from the front of the RV. She and Dad were already awake, staring out the windshield at more of the stone creatures surrounding us. "Everyone stay quiet," Dad said in his serious voice, the one he uses when things are really bad. "They haven't tried to get in yet." But Margaret started crying, and one of the stone things snapped its head toward the sound. Its rocky fingers reached for our window, leaving trails of gray wherever they touched. The glass began to cloud over, little crystals spreading across it like ice. That's when Dad grabbed the flashlight and shined it right at the creature. The beam passed right through its cracked eyes, making them glow brighter blue. The thing pulled back a little, but it didn't run away like I hoped it would. "The bathroom sink," Mom suddenly whispered. "It's still dripping from when I used it earlier." She was right. I could hear the quiet plink-plink of water drops hitting the sink, and the stone creature nearest to that side of the RV was keeping its distance. "They don't like water," I realized out loud, remembering how the creatures had backed away from the puddles left by evening dew. Dad nodded slowly, his mind working fast like it does when he's figuring out a problem at the museum. "Everyone grab the water bottles," he said quietly. "And Tim, get the spray bottle your mother uses for her plants. We might need them before this night is over." Outside, more stone figures were rising up from the ground, their rocky bodies creaking and grinding as they moved closer to our RV. Through the clouding windows, I could see the carved faces of Mount Rushmore in the moonlight. And now I was sure I wasn't imagining it. They really did look different, like they were watching us with eyes that shouldn't be able to move. We managed to make it through that first night by staying inside the RV and keeping water bottles close, but the next evening, everything got worse, way worse. Margaret had been quiet all day, drawing more pictures of the stone people, but these ones showed them reaching for a little girl, reaching for her. I should have watched her more carefully. I really should have. It happened just before sunset. Margaret went to pick up her colored pencils that had rolled under the RV. She was only out there for a few seconds, but that's all it took. I heard her scream and ran outside. One of the stone creatures had her hand. Where it touched her, Margaret's skin was turning gray and rough, spreading up her arm like she was becoming stone herself. I grabbed the spray bottle from inside and sprayed her arm with water. The creature let go with an angry grinding sound, but the gray didn't completely go away. Margaret's right hand and wrist stayed rough and cold, like a statue's. "It hurts," she whimpered as Mom held her. "It feels so cold." Dad found something in his research books, then stories about other sacred mountains where similar things had happened. There were pictures of stone carvings showing people being turned to stone by mountain spirits angry about their homes being destroyed. But Mom made an even scarier discovery. She found letters written by the man who carved Mount Rushmore, He wrote about guardians in the rock and how he had to work only during the day, never at night. He knew about these creatures all along. We tried to leave, but our RV wouldn't start. Every time Dad turned the key, the engine just made a grinding noise, like it was full of gravel. When we tried to walk away, we found the stone creatures had made a circle around us, forcing us closer and closer to the edge of a cliff. "Watch out," I yelled as one of them reached for Dad. He jumped back, but now we were trapped between the cliff and the stone creatures. They were closing in slowly, their rocky feet scraping against the ground. Margaret's partially stone hand was getting colder, and the gray was starting to creep up past her wrist. Mom held her close, trying to warm her up, but nothing seemed to help. That's when I noticed something in the distance, dark clouds rolling in fast over the mountains, and I remembered what Dad had read in those old files. The workers used to say the creatures never came out in the rain. "Dad," I whispered urgently, pointing at the sky. "I think help is coming." A low rumble of thunder echoed through the hills. The stone creatures paused, their cracked eyes turning toward the approaching storm, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they started moving faster, like they knew their time was running out. "The RV's water tank," Dad said suddenly. "If we can get to it." He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. We had one chance, but we'd have to be quick. Really quick. The first drops of rain started to fall as Dad made a run for the RV's water tank valve. One of the stone creatures reached for him, its rocky fingers just inches from his back. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst. "Timothy," Mom called out. "The garden hose. It's still connected to the RV." I grabbed the hose while Mom started reading something from Dad's research book, words in the Lakota language that she'd been practicing all day. Her voice was shaky but grew stronger with each word. The stone creatures didn't like that at all. They made this awful grinding noise, like rocks in a blender. The rain was falling harder now, and where it hit them, little pieces of their rocky bodies started crumbling away. Dad reached the water tank valve and turned it as hard as he could. Water burst out, spraying everywhere. I aimed the hose at the nearest creature, watching it back away as the water hit it. But there were so many of them, and our water tank wouldn't last forever. That's when it happened. While protecting Margaret, Dad didn't see the creature coming up behind him. It grabbed his shoulder, and I watched in horror as gray started spreading across Dad's back. "Frank!" Mom screamed. She ran to him, still reading from the book. The rain was pouring now, and lightning flashed across the sky. The creatures were backing away, breaking apart in the rain, but the one holding Dad wouldn't let go. Margaret broke free from where I was protecting her and ran toward Dad, her stone hand raised. When she touched the creature with her partially stone hand, something strange happened. Blue light sparked between them, and the creature stumbled back, confused. Mom's voice rose above the storm, speaking the final words from the book. Lightning struck somewhere very close, lighting up the whole mountainside. In that flash, I saw the faces on Mount Rushmore change, just for a second, like they were grimacing in pain. The stone creatures began crumbling faster in the pouring rain, breaking apart into piles of wet gravel. The one that had grabbed Dad finally let go, but not before the gray had spread across most of his back. When it was over, we stood there in the rain, hardly believing we were alive. Dad's back and shoulder had turned to stone like he was wearing a piece of the mountain. He said it didn't hurt, but he wouldn't be able to move that arm very well anymore. Margaret's hand stayed the same too, cold and gray, but she said she could still feel with it, just differently. As the sun rose the next morning, we packed up quickly and left. But before we drove away, I looked back at Mount Rushmore one last time. The presidents' faces looked normal again, except I could have sworn President Lincoln had a tiny smile that wasn't there before. Sometimes now, years later, Dad and Margaret put their stone parts together, and they feel a humming, like the mountain is still inside them. Mom says that's okay. It's just a reminder that some places deserve our respect, and that not all stories have completely happy endings. I still go camping, but I always bring an extra water bottle, and I never ever make fun of Margaret anymore when she says rocks are watching her. Because sometimes, just sometimes, they are. My name is Diana Mitchell, and I never thought I'd be telling this story to anyone. Some things are just too strange to believe, but everything I'm about to tell you really happened last summer at Mount Vernon, George Washington's old home. I guess I should start with who we are. I'm a high school art teacher married to James. He's a history professor who's crazy about anything to do with the American Revolution. Our son Christopher is 14. And just like his dad, he can't get enough of old battles and historical stuff. Sometimes I think those two speak their own language when they talk about the Revolutionary War. It all started when James got super excited about some newly found papers of George Washington. He practically bounced off the walls when he got permission to study them at Mount Vernon. The university gave him the whole summer for his research, so we decided to make it a family trip. We packed up our old Winnebagos, this huge vintage RV that James insisted on buying last year, and headed to Virginia. It'll be like a camping adventure, James said, showing us the new campground they'd opened near Mount Vernon. Christopher was thrilled, already planning which historical sites he wanted to visit. Me? I was just happy to see my boys so excited, even if I didn't share their obsession with dusty old documents. The campground was pretty nice, tucked away in the woods not far from the main estate. We could see the Potomac River through the trees, and on our first night the sunset over the water was beautiful. Everything felt peaceful, normal. Looking back now, I wish we'd paid more attention to how the air felt different there. Heavier somehow, like the woods were holding their breath. That first week, James spent his days in the library going through Washington's papers. He'd come back to the RV each evening with this weird look on his face. Usually he'd talk non-stop about his research, but now he seemed distracted. When I asked him about it, he just muttered something about Washington's dental problems showing up way too often in the records. "It's strange," he said one night, while we sat outside under the stars. "There are these odd notes, almost like receipts, but they're not for normal dental work. And the amounts listed, they're not just for dentures. It's like he was paying for something else." I remember telling him he was working too hard, that maybe he needed a break. If only I'd listened more carefully to what he was trying to tell me, maybe then we would have been better prepared for what was coming. But you can't prepare for something you don't believe in. And back then, I didn't believe in monsters. I didn't believe that some secrets should stay buried. And I certainly didn't believe that George Washington had made a deal with creatures that would come back to haunt us all. I guess that's where our real story begins. Not with the history or the research, but with the night everything in our RV moved by itself. The night we first smelled that awful mix of rotting wood and copper. The night my son Christopher found those ancient dentures half buried in the riverbank. The night we learned that some parts of history aren't in any books, and for good reason. I remember that first strange night clearly. I was doing the dishes in our RV's tiny kitchen while James was still at the library. Christopher had just gone to bed, and I was enjoying the quiet. Then I noticed something odd. All the cups in the cabinet were turned upside down. I was sure I'd put them away right side up that morning. "Chris?" I called out, thinking maybe he'd been playing around. No answer. When I checked, he was fast asleep. I tried to shake it off, but then other weird things started happening. Every morning we'd find our shoes arranged in perfect circles. Books would move from one shelf to another. Once I found all our spoons laid out on the counter in the shape of a tooth. The worst was the smell. It would come at night, this horrible mix of rotting wood and something metallic like old pennies. The first time we noticed it, James thought something had died under the RV. We searched everywhere but found nothing. The smell would disappear by morning, only to return the next night. Then came Christopher's discovery. He'd been exploring along the river's edge one afternoon, something we usually encouraged since it kept him away from his video games. I was reading outside the RV when he came running back, his hands cupped together, face flushed with excitement. "Mom! Mom! Look what I found." He opened his hands to show me what looked like old dentures, half covered in mud. They were tiny, like they were made for a child. But the teeth looked real. Too real. "Those need to stay outside," I said firmly, trying to hide how much they creeped me out. But Christopher had already run inside to show his dad, who'd just gotten back from the library. James went pale when he saw them. Without saying a word, he took the dentures and locked them in his research box. That night, I heard him on the phone with someone from the library, his voice tense and quiet. That's when the dreams started. I'd find myself back in time, walking through Mount Vernon, as it was hundreds of years ago. In my dreams, I could hear whispers coming from behind the walls, and the floorboards would creak with tiny footsteps. But the worst part was always the same. I'd look in a mirror and see my teeth slowly turning black, crumbling away while something chittered and laughed in the shadows. I started noticing how cold it got at night. Not normal cold, the kind that seeps into your bones. We'd wake up to frost on the inside of our windows, even though it was the middle of summer. The park rangers said it was just the river air, but I saw how they wouldn't quite meet our eyes when they said it. Christopher stopped sleeping well. He said his teeth hurt, but when we checked, they looked fine. James stayed later and later at the library, coming back with dark circles under his eyes. He'd spread his papers across our tiny dining table, muttering about patterns and payments and things that didn't make sense. I wanted to leave, pack up the RV, and drive away from whatever was happening. But something held us there, like we were being drawn into a story that had started long before we arrived. A story that was about to turn into a nightmare. It was a Wednesday night when we finally saw them. Christopher had been complaining about a toothache all day, and I was up late getting him some medicine. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from inside the walls of our RV. I froze. The scratching got louder, and then I saw something move in the shadows near the floor. At first I thought it was a rat, but rats don't glow with a faint bluish light. Rats don't have tiny human-like hands. I stood there, unable to move, as the creature emerged. It was about the size of a cat, but that's where any normal comparison ends. Its skin looked like old leather, stretched too tight over sharp bones. Its face was mostly teeth, rows and rows of them, all different sizes, like it had collected them from different mouths. Its eyes glowed like dying fireflies. When it saw me looking at it, it smiled. That's when I screamed. James came running from the bedroom, nearly tripping over another one of the creatures. They were everywhere now, crawling out from under the cabinets, dropping from the ceiling vents. Each one carried something that looked horribly like teeth. "Get Christopher," James shouted, but our son was already in the doorway of his room. His eyes were wide, and he was holding his jaw like his tooth pain had gotten worse. "They're tooth fairies," he said, but his voice sounded strange, distant. "The real ones, not like in the stories." One of the creatures chittered, a sound like breaking glass, and Christopher answered in the same horrible noise. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong with our son. James grabbed his research box and dumped it on the table. Papers went everywhere, but he was looking for the dentures Christopher had found. When he held them up, the creatures hissed and backed away. "I know what Washington did," James said, his voice shaking. "These weren't just dentures, they were proof of a deal. He made a bargain with them during the war. They helped him, collected teeth for his dentures, but he bound them with silver, kept them from hurting people. And now," I whispered, watching as more of the creatures gathered around Christopher. "Now the deal's broken. They want to make a new army, and they start by taking over people through tooth pain." James looked at our son with terror in his eyes. "They want Christopher." The creatures were closing in. Our son smiled at us, but it wasn't his smile anymore. His teeth had a metallic gleam, and his eyes had that same dying firefly glow. We had to act fast. James had found Washington's secret writings about the binding ritual, but we needed silver, was lots of it. The same kind Washington had used in his real dentures. As the creatures began to climb the walls, their teeth clicking together like angry wind chimes, I remembered something. In my purse, I had a collection of old silver dollars. a gift from my grandmother, that I'd always carried for good luck. Maybe, just maybe, we could save our son. But first, we had to survive the night. We need to get to Washington's tomb, James said, grabbing my purse with the silver dollars. That's where he performed the original binding ritual. It's the only place strong enough. But Christopher, whatever was controlling him now, blocked the RV's door. His smile had gotten wider, impossibly wide, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like rustling dead leaves. "The old bargain is done," he said, but it wasn't really him saying it. "We want new teeth, fresh teeth, young teeth." The creatures swarmed around him, their tiny hands reaching for us. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed one of my silver dollars and threw it at them. They screamed and scattered, the silver leaving burning marks where it touched them. "Run!" James shouted, grabbing Christopher's arm. Our son fought back, suddenly strong as a grown man, but James didn't let go. I kept throwing silver dollars, making a path through the creatures as we rushed out of the RV. The night was pitch black, but we knew the way to Washington's tomb. We'd visited it enough times during the day. The creatures followed us, their blue glow lighting up the trees like evil Christmas lights. They were singing now, an awful song that made my teeth ache. Christopher kept fighting us, trying to run back to the creatures. "Let me go," he screamed, but his voice didn't sound human anymore. "They promised me power. They promised me I'd never have tooth pain again." "That's not our son talking," James panted as we ran. "Remember the ritual words from the documents. I'll say them, you handle the silver." We reached the tomb just as the creatures caught up with us. There were hundreds of them now, covering the ground like a glowing blue carpet of nightmares. They were carrying all sorts of teeth. Some looked ancient, some frighteningly fresh. James pulled Christopher into the tomb with him, holding him tight even as our son thrashed and bit. I stood at the entrance, throwing silver dollars whenever the creatures got too close. Each coin burned through them like a mini firework, leaving holes in their swarm. Inside the tomb, James began to recite the words he'd found in Washington's papers. They were in Latin, and even though I couldn't understand them, I could feel their power. The air got heavy, like right before a storm. The creatures went crazy. They rushed at us in waves, climbing over each other, their teeth clacking together like angry castanets. I threw my last silver dollar, just as one leaped for my face. Christopher screamed, a sound of pure pain that tore through my heart. One of his teeth fell out, bouncing on the tomb's stone floor. The creatures all dove for it at once, fighting each other to get it. James finished the ritual words, his voice booming in the small space. Everything went quiet for a moment. Then Christopher collapsed in his arms, and all the creatures froze. A soft voice spoke from the shadows, ancient, tired, but somehow familiar from my dreams. It sounded like General Washington himself. "The bargain must be renewed," it said. But this time with limits. The creatures bowed their heads. One of them stepped forward, holding Christopher's fallen tooth like an offering. It looked at me with those firefly eyes, and spoke in perfect English. "We accept new terms. We will take only teeth freely given, never stolen. We will help those in pain, not cause it. This we swear, by silver and bone." Just like that they were gone. All of them, taking Christopher's tooth with them. The night was suddenly normal again, with just the sound of crickets and our heavy breathing. Christopher woke up confused but okay. The tooth he'd lost was one that had been loose anyway. Why, as though he doesn't remember it falling out, his other teeth stopped hurting right away. When we took him to a dentist later, they said his teeth were perfectly healthy. We spent our last week at Mount Vernon packing up James's research. He wrote a different paper than he'd planned. Nothing about tooth fairies, of course. Nobody would believe that. Instead, he wrote about Washington's leadership and how he took care of his soldiers' health. It won an award, actually. Sometimes at night I still check under the bathroom sink or behind the mirror just to make sure nothing's there. And every time Christopher has a loose tooth, we're extra careful. We leave it under his pillow with a small silver coin just in case. Better to keep the bargain, we figure. James found something interesting in those old documents before we left. Apparently, Washington didn't just care about winning the war, he cared about doing it right. Even when dealing with creatures like the tooth fairies, he made rules to protect people. That's why they respected him enough to make a deal in the first place. The creatures keep their word. We've never seen them again, but sometimes on very quiet nights, we hear faint chittering in the walls. And every once in a while, Christopher finds old silver coins in unexpected places under his video game console, in his shoe, or sitting on his windowsill. We still have our RV, though we cleaned it thoroughly after that night. The smell of rotting wood and copper never came back. We've been on other camping trips since then, but we haven't returned to Mount Vernon. Some places you visit only once in a lifetime. Last week, Christopher lost another tooth. A normal loose tooth, nothing scary about it. As I helped him put it under his pillow, he asked me if I thought the tooth fairies would come. The nice ones or the scary ones? He asked with a grin. I just smiled and tucked him in. Some questions don't need answers. Some stories are better left in the shadows where they belong. But I did leave a small silver coin next to his tooth, just to be safe. After all, a deal is a deal, and somewhere in Mount Vernon, in the quiet halls and dark corners of history, tiny creatures with glowing eyes still keep their ancient bargain, not because they have to, but because a great man once showed them a better way. That's the real legacy George Washington left behind. Not just as a president or a general, but as someone who knew that even the scariest monsters can be reasoned with, if you're brave enough to try. Just don't forget the silver coins. My name is Catherine Walsh, and I'm still trying to make sense of what happened on Alcatraz Island last summer. I've been a marine biologist for 15 years, studying how fish behave in the San Francisco Bay, but nothing in my research could have prepared me for what my children and I discovered in those dark waters around the prison. It all started when I noticed something weird happening with the fish near Alcatraz. Usually, fish follow regular patterns. They know where to feed, where to breed, and which waters to avoid. But suddenly, entire schools of fish were swimming in circles around the island, like they were being pulled by some invisible force. Other marine biologists thought I was imagining things, but I knew something wasn't right. I decided to study this strange behavior up close, and that meant staying on the island overnight. My kids, Lucy and Peter, were on summer break, and since my husband was away on a business trip, they had to come with me. Lucy, being 15, rolled her eyes at the idea of spending time with her nerdy mom, but 13-year-old Peter was excited. He loved anything that sounded like an adventure. We packed our RV with equipment and parked it at Fisherman's Wharf. The smell of fresh seafood and sourdough bread filled the air as tourists walked by, taking pictures of the sea lions at Pier 39. Everything seemed so normal then. If only I had known what was waiting for us on that island. The boat ride to Alcatraz was choppy that evening. Dark clouds were rolling in from the Pacific, and the famous San Francisco fog was starting to wrap around the Golden Gate Bridge like a thick blanket. Lucy sat at the front of our small research boat, her long dark hair whipping in the wind, while Peter helped me check our equipment one last time. As we got closer to the island, I noticed how different Alcatraz looked without all the tourists. The old prison buildings stood tall and gray against the darkening sky, their empty windows staring down at us like hollow eyes. The birds that usually filled the air with their noisy crying were unusually quiet. The park ranger who gave us special permission to stay overnight helped us dock our boat and carry our gear to the main building. He gave us a radio to use in case of emergencies and reminded us to stay away from the crumbling parts of the prison. The old cell blocks can be dangerous at night, he warned, before heading back to the mainland on the last tourist ferry. We set up our equipment in what used to be the prison library. Lucy found an old chair and started reading something on her phone, while Peter pressed his face against a barred window, watching the fog roll in thicker and thicker, until we could barely see the lights of San Francisco. "Mom," he said, not taking his eyes off the window, "do you think the stories about Alcatraz being haunted are true?" I smiled and ruffled his curly hair. "No, honey, there's always a scientific explanation for everything." I believed those words when I said them, but now, after everything we've seen, I'm not so sure anymore. Because what we found in those dark waters around Alcatraz wasn't just scientifically impossible, it was beyond anything I could have imagined in my worst nightmares. And this was just the beginning of our story. That first night started quietly enough. I set up my underwater cameras and sensors near the shore while the kids helped arrange our sleeping bags in the library. The old prison walls kept out most of the wind, but they couldn't block the constant drip 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 of water somewhere in the darkness. Around midnight, my equipment started picking up strange readings. The water temperature near the underwater caves was much warmer than it should be, and there was this weird blue-green glow coming from deep below. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years of research. "Lucy, Peter," I called out. "Come look at this." They huddled around my laptop screen, watching as schools of fish swam in perfect circles around something we couldn't quite see. But what really caught our attention was the sound coming through my underwater microphones. A low humming noise that seemed to pulse with the waves. "That's not normal, is it, Mom?" Lucy asked, suddenly not looking so bored anymore. Before I could answer, Peter grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" We all went quiet. At first I heard nothing but the waves hitting the shore, and the wind whistling through the old prison bars. But then, there it was. A sound like singing, but not quite human, floating down from the abandoned cell blocks above us. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I said it, I knew wind didn't sound like that. Wind doesn't make melodies. Lucy pulled out her phone to record the sound, but it died immediately, even though she'd just charged it. Peter's flashlight started flickering too, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Maybe we should check it out," Peter suggested, his voice shaking slightly. Part of me wanted to say no, to stay right where we were with our equipment and our emergency radio. But I was here to research unusual occurrences, wasn't I? And whatever was causing these strange patterns in the fish had to have an explanation. "We'll go together," I decided, grabbing our backup flashlights and my research tablet. "Stay close." We made our way through the dark corridors, our footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. The singing grew louder as we climbed the stairs to B Block, where the worst prisoners used to be kept. The air felt thick and salty, like we were breathing in sea mist, even though we were far from the water. That's when we found the first sign that something was very wrong. In one of the cells, scattered across the floor, were dozens of classified-looking documents. They were old and water-stained, but I could still make out words like Project Nautilus and Human Enhancement Trials. As I picked up one of the papers, a loud splash echoed from somewhere below us, followed by what sounded like something large dragging itself across wet concrete. Lucy grabbed my hand. "Mom," she whispered, "I don't think we're alone here." The singing had stopped. In its place was a sound I'll never forget, a wet clicking noise, like someone speaking underwater, coming from the darkness at the end of the corridor. And then our last flashlight went out. For a few terrifying seconds, we stood frozen in the pitch-black corridor. Peter's hand found mine, and I could feel him trembling. The clicking sounds were getting closer, and now I could hear something else, the splash of water with every movement, even though we were on the upper floor. "My phone," Lucy whispered suddenly. "It's working again." The dim light from her screen gave us just enough light to see each other's faces. That's when we saw it. Water seeping under the cell doors, spreading across the floor like dark fingers reaching for our feet. But this wasn't normal water. It had that same blue-green glow I'd seen in my underwater cameras. "Back to the library," I said quietly. Now, we turned around slowly, trying not to splash in the growing puddles. But as Lucy's phone light swept across the corridor, it caught something that made my heart stop. A face, but not a human face, was peering at us from one of the cell windows. It had large dark eyes that reflected the light like a cat's, and what looked like gills along its neck. The face disappeared as quickly as we saw it, followed by the sound of something swimming away fast. We ran. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, with Peter and Lucy right beside me. Back in the library, I slammed the heavy door shut, and pushed a desk against it. Our sleeping bags were soaked. Somehow, the glowing water had reached here too. Mom, Lucy's voice was shaking. What was that thing? I pulled the wet papers from my pocket, the ones I'd found in the cell. As I read them under the light of Lucy's phone, my hands started shaking too. These are government documents, I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. From the 1950s, they were doing experiments here, not just on the prisoners, but in the water around the island. Peter leaned in closer. What kind of experiments? They were trying to create people who could breathe underwater, special soldiers who could swim anywhere, and never need to come up for air. But something went wrong. The test subjects, they changed too much, started becoming more fish than human. The government shut everything down and sealed the lower levels. But what, Mom? Lucy asked, though I think she already knew. But they didn't all die. According to these notes, some escaped into the deeper parts of the bay, and now, I looked at the glowing water still seeping under the door. Now they're coming back. They're trying to take over the island again. A loud bang on the door made us all jump. The desk scraped against the floor as something pushed against it from the other side. The boat, Peter suddenly said. We need to get to our boat. But when we looked out the window toward the dock, our hearts sank. In the dim light of the moon breaking through the fog, we could see our little boat was gone. Only bubbles rising to the surface showed where it had been. Lucy's phone light flickered again and died. In the darkness we could hear more of them now. Those clicking voices coming from all around us. The water was rising faster. They're flooding the building, I realized with horror. They're trying to force us down to the lower levels, where they live. That's when Lucy remembered something that would turn out to be our only hope for survival. Mom, she said. Your RV at the wharf, it has a fresh water tank, right? I nodded, not yet understanding. I saw how they moved when they came near us. They stick to the shadows, avoid the light, and they're like sea creatures. Her voice got stronger as she worked it out. What if they can only survive in salt water? For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a tiny spark of hope. But our boat was gone. We had no way to call for help, and these creatures were everywhere. We needed a plan, and we needed it fast. The water was now up to our ankles in the library, and that weird blue-green glow made everything look like we were already underwater. But Peter, my brave, clever Peter, remembered something important from the tour guide's speech earlier that day. The prison had a riot control system, he said excitedly. They used to have water hoses to control the prisoners. Maybe some of the pipes still work, but the controls would be in the guard tower. Lucy pointed out, we'd have to get past them. I looked across the bay where my RV was parked at Fisherman's Wharf. Its big white shape was just visible in the foggy darkness. The fresh water tank held 50 gallons, more than enough to create a path through these creatures, if Lucy was right about their weakness. I have an idea, I said, pulling my emergency flares from my research kit. But we'll have to work together, and we'll have to be quick. I handed 2 flares to each of them. The creatures didn't like light. We'd seen that already. Lucy, you're the fastest runner. While Peter and I create a distraction with the flares, you need to get to the guard tower and find those water controls. But Mom, what if they catch me? Lucy's voice trembled. I squeezed her hand. Remember what you figured out. They need salt water. If you get splashed, it won't hurt you. But their touch, just don't let them grab you. Peter stood up straighter. I can help with the distraction. I'll go the opposite way from you, Mom. They'll have to split up to follow us. My heart swelled with pride even as it ached with fear for my children. Okay, here's what we'll do. The next few minutes were like a nightmare come to life. We burst out of the library, flares blazing red in the darkness. The creatures screeched, a horrible sound between a whale's song and a scream. and retreated from the bright lights. I ran toward the shore, waving my flare at the glowing water. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, following me. I could hear Peter on the other side of the building, shouting and keeping another group of them distracted. Through the chaos, I caught glimpses of Lucy's shadow darting up the guard tower stairs. The creatures were so focused on the flares, they didn't notice her. My flare was starting to die when I heard it, the groan of old pipes coming to life. Then suddenly, streams of fresh water burst from the riot control system, spraying across the prison grounds. The effect was immediate. The creatures let out horrible shrieks as the fresh water hit them. They retreated from it like it was acid, diving back into the salt water of the bay. The glowing water that had been flooding the prison began to drain away. "Lucy, you did it," Peter shouted from across the yard. We regrouped at the guard tower, soaked but alive. As we caught our breath, we saw lights approaching from the bay, lots of them. Government boats, their sirens wailing. "They must have spotted the flares," I said. The cleanup team arrived just minutes later, wearing hazmat suits and carrying all sorts of equipment. They hustled us onto a boat and started asking questions about what we'd seen. I handed them the waterlogged documents I'd found. As they took us back to the mainland, I watched teams of divers searching the waters around Alcatraz, but I knew they wouldn't find all of them. The bay is deep, with lots of dark places to hide. Sometimes at night, I still look out at the bay and wonder about them. The government cleaned up the prison, sealed the underwater caves, and said the whole thing was just a chemical spill that caused mass hallucinations. But I know what we saw. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick over San Francisco Bay, I see that blue-green glow under the water, moving slowly toward deeper waters. The creatures are still out there, waiting in the dark depths, looking for a way to take back what they think is theirs. Lucy doesn't roll her eyes at my nerdy research anymore. Peter still loves adventures, but he stays away from the water. And me? I keep studying the bay's fish patterns, but now I do it from the safety of the shore. Some mysteries I've learned are better left in the deep.